outside my window.
Hello, and welcome to The Bard's Truth with your host, the Green Bard. This is Dany's Dragon Bonds, Volume 5, Part 4, Detente between Drogon and Dany, covering the finale to her last POV chapter in A Dance with Dragons. In our initial analysis of the chapter, we also discussed that Drogon has been shadowing Dany the entire chapter, even as she attempts to flee his home for her false home, Meereen. Last time, we discussed that some believe Dany's thoughts, hallucinations, visions in this chapter, the ones in the voices of the stars, the grass, Jorah Mormont, and Viserys, to be all efforts by Quaithe to influence Dany, using glass candle communication. I do not subscribe to that interpretation wholly. Clearly, the interactions with the stars are Quaithe, as we covered last episode, when I suggested the voice of the grass to be not Quaithe, but Drogon. We also covered Dany's interactions with Viserys, with little indication that this was anything other than her own inner monologue with that piece of Viserys that lives on in her own memory. That should be our null hypothesis for her interactions with the voice of Jorah Mormont as well, which we'll cover now. I discount any suggestion that Mormont is communicating with Dany telepathically. He doesn't have the means, a glass candle, even if he does have the gift, which of course is suggested by his winning in jousting back in the day, although that might have been his wife. Further, Mormont's voice is also conflated with the grass. Could it be then a blend of Dany's inner monologue, but influenced by Drogon's feelings? It must be remembered that Drogon has first-hand knowledge of almost everything Dany and Mormont discussed following A Game of Thrones, so the dragon would know enough to partly be the source of that dialogue, even as Dany supplies much of it herself. Further, the grass has been swaying to Drogon's wing beats from time to time throughout this chapter. George R. R. Martin may be using that as a way of linking Drogon's voice to the grass, but not stating it to the reader. We discussed a little bit of that last time. So let's step into the dialogue. It begins with the grass speaking in the voice of Jorah Mormont.
"Never," said the grass in the gruff tones of Jorah Mormont. "You were warned, your grace. Let this city be, I said. Your war is in Westeros, I told you." The voice was no more than a whisper, yet somehow Dany felt that he was walking behind her. My bear, she thought. My old sweet bear, who loved me and betrayed me. She had missed him so. She wanted to see his ugly face, to wrap her arms around him and press herself against his chest. But she knew that if she turned around, Ser Jorah would be gone. "I am dreaming," she said. "A waking dream, a walking dream. I am alone and lost." "Lost because you lingered in a place you were never meant to be," murmured Ser Jorah, as softly as the wind. "Alone because you sent me from your side."
She also seemed to send Drogon from her side too. Interesting. Drogon doesn't like Meereen. The violence of the pit scene is proof enough of that. To wit, the idea that Meereen isn't home could easily be interpreted to be a dragonish thought, given how uncomfortable it became for Dany, even as Westeros being home is an idea that Dany got more from Mormont or Viserys than from herself or her dragons. Dany knows it isn't home as well. She had this thought a bit earlier in the chapter as she ventured in that direction.
Meereen was not her home, and never would be. Meereen would always be the Harpy's city, and Daenerys could not be a Harpy.
The next paragraphs continue the discussion of Meereen not being home, but otherwise show little indication of the voice of Drogon. But for one more mention of the grass speaking.
"I did," the grass whispered sadly.
The passage continues with Dany and the voice affirming she is a queen and continuing the discussion of why she was in Meereen. It turns, though, on the final statement from the grass and Dany's response. This is very dragonish. If this is indeed Drogon, it is a plea for her to embrace her inheritance, the fire in her blood.
"I was tired, Jorah. I was weary of war. I wanted to rest, to laugh, to plant trees and see them grow. I am only a young girl." "No, you are the blood of the dragon." The whispering was growing fainter, as if Ser Jorah were falling behind. "Dragons plant no trees. Remember that. Remember who you are, what you were made to be. Remember your words." "Fire and blood," Daenerys told the swaying grass.
Dany does seem to be swayed by Drogon in this passage. Some might say she does embrace fire and blood here. I hold back from that, but I believe she is accepting that part of herself, a part that she has rejected for most of A Dance with Dragons. She is also accepting Drogon, no longer trying to flee back to Meereen. It is a truce, a détente. Notice that the voice gets fainter throughout the dialogue. There is a decent argument that George R. R. Martin has this happen to simulate Quaithe's communication mode, the stars, fading out as the sun rises. I would counter that Drogon could be flying away at those times too. Note that Dany is barefoot, and her suffering feet are soothed in that passage. My friend on Reddit, u/Roinfart, once pointed out that George R. R. Martin put a subtle dichotomy in the symbolism of her being barefoot in this chapter. He said,
Barefootedness seems to symbolize a loss/lack of identity. But what's interesting is that for Dany, being barefoot is something good, something she associates with her simple, peaceful childhood.
So knowing that home for Dany is that house with the red door, with the lemon tree outside her window, where she played barefoot, and that place is definitely not Meereen, where she tried to plant trees and failed, where she could not find the peace she is seeking. In the end, she goes back to Drogon, her chariot of fire, who bore her away from Meereen, with one slipper a la Cinderella, to continue that winding journey home, now barefoot, closer to that place of peace. But the final thing that cements the détente, the truce, is a threat to her person, and the theme of protection coming back one final time.
A stone turned under her foot. She stumbled to one knee and cried out in pain, hoping against hope that her bear would gather her up and help her to her feet. When she turned her head to look for him, all she saw was trickling brown water, and the grass, still moving slightly. The wind, she told her, the wind shakes the stalks and makes them sway. Only no wind was blowing. The sun was overhead, and the world still hot. Midges swarmed in the air, and a dragonfly floated over the stream, darting here and there. And the grass was moving when it had no cause to move. She fumbled in the water, found a stone the size of her fist, pulled it from the mud. It was a poor weapon, but better than an empty hand. From the corner of her eye, Dany saw the grass move again, off to her right. The grass swayed and bowed low as if before a king, but no king appeared to her. The world was green and empty. The world was green and silent. The world was yellow, dying. I should get up, she told herself. I have to walk. I have to follow the stream.
Dany is alarmed here. Will Drogon sense this through the bond? Could this movement of the grass be evidence that Drogon is still shadowing her? Clearly he has kept himself close as we discussed before. Or is George R. R. Martin, having conflated the grass moving with Drogon earlier in the chapter, and then with the voices in Dany's head, perhaps even Drogon's voice, now using the grass to announce the appearance of the Dothraki? Mixed metaphors here, of course. Even so, the grass protects Dany by hiding her, even as Drogon is still shadowing her, making himself seen now to deter the rider.
Through the grass came a soft silvery tinkling. One rider, and alone, a scout. He was one who rode before the Khalasar to find the game and the good green grass, and sniff out foes wherever they might hide. If he found her there, he would kill her, rape her, or enslave her. At best, he would send her back to the crones of the Dosh Khaleen, where good Khaleesi were supposed to go when their Khals had died. He did not see her, though. The grass concealed her, and he was looking elsewhere. Dany followed his eyes, and there the shadow flew, with her wings spread wide. The dragon was a mile off, and yet the scout stood frozen until his stallion began to whicker in fear. Then he woke as if from a dream, wheeled his mount about, and raced off through the tall grass at a gallop.
So Drogon is protecting her, both as the grass and in his own skin. Drogon's appearance must have sent Dany into exaltation. In this moment, she understands that Drogon is not just power or death, but also life, a lifelong bond, protection. She is intent on riding him again, back not to Meereen, but to the Dothraki.
Dany watched him go. When the sounds of hooves had faded away to silence, she began to shout. She called until her voice was hoarse. And Drogon came, snorting plumes of smoke. The grass bowed down before him. Dany leapt onto his back. She stank of blood and sweat and fear, but none of that mattered. To go forward, I must go back, she said. Her bare legs tightened around the dragon's neck. She kicked him, and Drogon threw himself into the sky. Her whip was gone, so she used her hands and feet and turned him north by east. The way the scout had gone, Drogon went willingly enough. Perhaps he smelled the rider's fear. In a dozen heartbeats they were past the Dothraki, as he galloped far below. To the right and left, Dany glimpsed places where the grass was burned and ashen. Drogon had come this way before, she realized. Like a chain of gray islands, the marks of his hunting dotted the green grass sea.
And now they hunt together again. They also have what one might call a ritual feast to cement their bond, their truce, their détente. It is savage.
A vast herd of horses appeared below them. There were riders, too, a score or more, but they turned and fled at the sight of the dragon. The horses broke and ran when the shadow fell upon them, racing through the grass until their sides were white with foam, tearing the ground with their hooves, but as swift as they were, they could not fly. Soon one horse began to lag behind the others. The dragon descended on him, roaring, and all at once the poor beast was aflame. Yet somehow he kept on running, screaming with every step, until Drogon landed on him and broke his back. Dany clutched the dragon's neck with all her strength to keep from sliding off. The carcass was too heavy for him to bear back to his lair, so Drogon consumed the kill there, tearing at the charred flesh as the grasses burned around them, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burnt horsehair. Dany, starved, slid off his back and ate with him, ripping chunks of smoking meat from the dead horse with bare, burned hands. In Meereen, I was a queen in silk, nibbling on stuffed dates and honeyed lamb, she remembered. What would my noble husband think if he could see me now? Hisdar would be horrified, no doubt, but Daario? Daario would laugh, carve off a hunk of horse meat with his arak, and squat down to eat beside her.
We discussed the contrast between Daario and Hisdar throughout our analysis of A Dance with Dragons. The final mention of the two shows that Dany is definitely rejecting Hisdar in his perfumed piece, even as she accepts that the savage Daario would fit right in with her and Drogon at this moment. That said, this does not mean she is choosing violence. It isn't and cannot be that cut and dried. George R.R. Martin writes gray, not black and white. He also writes in color. I love the image of Dany and Drogon in this scene that follows, as the whole of Jaqo's Khalasar approaches.
As the western sky turned the color of a blood bruise, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Dany rose, wiped her hands on her ragged undertunic, and went to stand beside her dragon. That was how Khal Jaqo found her, when 100 mounted warriors emerged from the drifting smoke.
With the appearance of Jaqo, we recall that late in A Game of Thrones she vowed vengeance for Aroa against Jaqo and his blood rider, Maego, and this is plainly her opportunity for such.
Jaqo named himself Khal Jaqo and rode off with even more. Maego, his blood rider, raped and murdered Aroa, a girl Daenerys had once saved from him. Only the birth of her dragons amidst the fire and smoke of Khal Drogo's funeral pyre had spared Dany herself from being dragged back to Vaes Dothrak, to live out the remainder of her days amongst the crones of the Dosh Khaleen.
And then,
if I look back, I am lost. It was a cruel fate, Dany said, yet not so cruel as Maego's will be. I promise you that, by the old gods and the new, by the lamb god and the horse god, and every god that lives, I swear it by the mother of mountains and the womb of the world. Before I am done with them, Maego and Jaqo will plead for the mercy they showed Aroa.
Again we read, if I look back, I am lost, the refrain from A Game of Thrones that came back to our analysis a couple episodes ago. Dany is now faced with the choice of going back to the Dothraki, taking Quaithe's advice to go forward you must go back, or choosing vengeance and not looking back. Would embracing fire and blood fully and the vengeance she promised breed more violence? Or can she enact justice, swift and fair? Will Dany choose the middle road, going back to glean what she can from the Dosh Khaleen to find balance, but not get lost? I think she finds that balance, but we need more books to know for sure. I definitely can't accept what we saw on the screen as a fitting conclusion to her story. All I want for Christmas is the winds of winter. As to Drogon, I think I have presented here a compelling case that the black and red dragon is asserting his will with Dany, pulling her toward fire and blood. As a red-eyed beast, like Ghost, Drogon is magically powerful and will be a formidable match for Dany to assert her will over and hopefully to find that balance. That's it for this series until we get more books. Thanks to all those who have helped me along the way in this. Peace. Thanks to all the terrific artists whose work is featured on this video. Thanks especially to those in my family who helped in this series so far.
Outside my window is a tree
outside my window is a tree.
If you enjoyed this content, you can also consider supporting us on Patreon.